This is widely considered one of the greatest Doctor Strange stories Marvel has ever told, and at the same time, one of the most tragic. But this isn't just a standalone story. It's part of a larger 5-issue miniseries called The Best Defense. The series is structured as a chain of one-shots, each focusing on a different character. It begins with Immortal Hulk, and interestingly, the ending of that issue actually sets up the beginning of the entire narrative. From there, the story moves through Namor, then into Doctor Strange, which is the chapter we're focusing on, before continuing into Silver Surfer. Finally, everything comes together in the Defenders one-shot, where the full story is brought to its conclusion. So without wasting any more time, let's dive in. But before we start the video, if you're new to our channel, please subscribe, because your one subscription motivates us to create more amazing videos like this. Let's jump into it. So, our comic opens with Doctor Strange, and he just says, "The end is nigh. I can feel the truth in my frail bones. Soon I will be dead. And after everything that's happened, I will welcome it. But not yet." And then he picks up a rock and slightly keep it in his bag. Okay, now one thing you need to keep in mind is that everything he does in this story matters. Every action has a purpose, and all of it builds towards something that comes together in the end. So yeah, this is one of those moments where you really need to pay close attention to every detail. And with that, he keeps moving forward. The second piece in his many hours. I'm close now. Time to pull out all the stops. And then he literally pull up his one eye. Oof, I can feel this pain, imagination, haha. Okay, and then he says, "Magic has a cost, and I'm broke." And then he says, "I can see again." Now, for anyone familiar with Doctor Strange, you already know that the Eye of Agamotto allows him to see through any kind of magical illusion. It reveals reality as it truly is, no matter how deeply it's hidden. But at the same time, we start getting a clearer picture of what's happening in this world. The moon itself is nearly shattered, not completely gone, but cracked apart across space. Around Doctor Strange, the buildings are completely destroyed, reduced to rubble.
And this is where things start to feel familiar, because it closely mirrors that end-of-the-world scenario we saw in The Incredible Hulk, where everything has essentially fallen apart. And in the middle of all this devastation, Doctor Strange says, "I'm Dr. Stephen Strange, the once and future Sorcerer Supreme, last defender of planet Earth. Well, almost the last." And then he says, "The Eye of Agamotto lights my path one last time. I hope when I get to the center of this glassy wasteland that enough remains from the impact for me to finish my journey. Dormammu's spawn will smell the eye. They will come for me. I am counting on it." And that's exactly what we see unfold, because it quickly becomes clear that this entire landscape is overrun by the forces of Dormammu. Everywhere you look, it's filled with these grotesque, nightmarish creations, beings that have been twisted, warped, and completely corrupted. They're not natural anymore. They've been reshaped and tormented into horrifying forms, transformed into something else entirely, something born from Dormammu's own design. And then Doctor Strange says, "I've lost track of the years since the collision that devastated the Earth. After the cosmic train wreck, our enemies pounced. Dormammu arrived and won the battle. Now, one of us will win the war." Now, this is a really important point when it comes to Dormammu's mythos in Doctor Strange lore. Over the years, one thing has been made very clear. If Dormammu ever truly found a way to fully enter the main Marvel universe, he would be nearly unstoppable. His level of magic is on a completely different scale. For most Earth-based heroes, there would be no real way to stop him. It would basically be the end. Now, to be fair, that doesn't apply to the entire Marvel cosmos. There are beings out there who surpass Dormammu. We've seen situations like that Doctor Strange storyline involving Galactus, where Galactus enters the Dark Dimension, absorbs Dormammu, and takes his power. And then you have entities like Zom, who exist on an even higher level, with power so immense that even the Living Tribunal had to step in and seal him away. Even Dormammu himself draws from Zom's power. So yes, there are forces capable of destroying Dormammu, but if you're an Earth-based hero, that distinction doesn't really matter. For you, it's game over. And yet, in the middle of all this chaos and destruction, Doctor Strange suddenly hears a voice coming from inside his bag. And that voice says, "They're hunting you, Stephen." And Doctor Strange just says, "I know." And then he picks up another bricks. But then, without hesitation, he just swings it straight up, clocks one of those mutated creatures right across the head with it. But then they started talking with the voice of Dormammu. "At night, did you hear us feast on your people as we laughed at you?" And then Doctor Strange just says, "I did, Dormammu. It made me angry. Now face me." And one of the mutants brutally attacked Doctor Strange, and then Doctor Strange just says, "Okay, I told you I needed you to save yourself for the end, but this might be it. You hear me? Wake up, you filthy rag." He's actually talking to his cloak, and his cloak is wrapped around in mutant head. And then Doctor Strange just says, "Thank you. I always wanted a magic scarf anyway." And then he says, "I summon the winds of Watum." And then he says, "My fingers don't move like they used to. That's where my orthopedic internship comes in handy." And so he keeps pushing forward, struggling just to move, but manages to do just enough to force the creature off of him. But that's all he's got left in him, and right there, in that moment, he simply says, "Face me, Dormammu, or are you afraid of an old man?" And then, voice from a bag and says, "They'll wait for night to finish you off. That's what I would do." And then Doctor Strange just says, "I know." And the voice says again, "Sounds bad, Steve. You're dying, right?" And then Doctor Strange says, "Yes." And then voice says, "I've done some bad things, but I never cannibalized myself." And then Strange says, "Being the Sorcerer Supreme is the hardest job in the world." And that's where voice just says, "So there's still a world, huh?" And then Strange shouts him and says, "Quiet, or I'll gag you with the crimson bands of Sitarak." And then voice just says, "Heh, good luck, old man. Ha ha ha."
And so at that point, Strange says, "Show me the way home." And then a light comes from an Eye of Agamotto. And as that happens, he starts moving forward again until he finally reaches this impact point, a massive crater that looks like the epicenter of all the destruction around him. This is Ground Zero, the place where everything seems to have been wiped out. And standing there, he just smiles. A light begins to guide the path ahead of him, and in that moment, he simply says, "By the Vishanti, I found it." And he says, "This will do." And at that moment, he casts the flames of the Faltine. Now, quick bit of context here, because this is something that's kind of been lost over time in the comic space. When it comes to Dormammu and his sister Umar, they belong to a race known as the Faltine. These aren't just regular beings, they're entities made entirely of pure magical energy. And contrary to what a lot of people think, Dormammu and Umar weren't always rulers of the Dark Dimension. In fact, the Dark Dimension itself wasn't always what it is now. There was a time when it existed as a single unified realm, but after a massive reality-shattering event, that realm was broken apart into what's been described as the Archipelago of Anguish, basically a collection of splintered dimensions. That's why you have different territories ruled by different entities, Mephisto, Nightmare, and others, each existing in their own separate pocket dimension. Dormammu just happens to control the largest and dominant one. They don't overlap like a shared kingdom. They're divided, isolated realms with their own boundaries. At some point, Dormammu and Umar entered what became the Dark Dimension, and as beings of pure magical energy, took control of it, and they've ruled it ever since. Now, there's a lot more depth to that story, but that's the simplified version. And this is exactly why whenever Doctor Strange needs to tap into Dormammu's power or seek his presence, he invokes the flames of the Faltine. So as Strange begins to collapse, the voice from inside the bag speaks up and says, "Now you're ringing the dinner bell." And then Doctor Strange says, "Indeed I am. Just be ready to do your part when Dormammu arrives." And then he goes for sleep. And then he wake up inside something that feels more like a nightmare than reality. And standing there is Clea, looking right at him. As she begins to speak, she says, "You are not the man I thought you were. Is our marriage not worth fighting for?" And then Strange says, "Clea, I fought monsters from beyond the veil that wanted to burn this world in hellfire, and I knew exactly what to say to them, but I don't have the words you need to hear now." And then Clea says, "Then goodbye, Stephen," and then leaves. And just like that, he loses her forever. Now, again, that ties back into the larger Best Defense storyline, but the key thing here is what happens next, because this is where the focus shifts.
And suddenly, he's not just wandering anymore. He's being hunted, chased down by Nightmare, and then Nightmare just tells him, "This is how it ends. You were always so arrogant, Strange, as a physician, and especially as a sorcerer." And Strange runs for his life, and he just says, "Stay back!" And then Nightmare just tells him, "You never stood a chance against your nightmare." And Nightmare just starts toying with him, mocking Stephen Strange as he runs. Now, there are two key reasons why Strange is fleeing here. The first is tied to his own past, his own fears and failures, but the second is Nightmare himself. Because Nightmare is far more powerful than most people realize. In certain storylines like Marvel Orvature, we've seen just how insane his power can get. There's a point where he puts essentially everyone to sleep, not just on Earth, but across the universe, and starts feeding off that energy. At that level, he becomes so powerful that he's able to challenge, even overwhelm cosmic entities on a massive scale, reaching heights just below the one above all. That's the thing about Nightmare. His power depends on sleepers. Normally, you never see him at full strength because it's limited by how many minds he can draw from. But when that limit is removed, he becomes something else entirely. And right as all of this unfolds, Strange is suddenly jolted awake. That's when the truth hits. Dormammu is here. He's arrived. And in that moment, he simply says, "Awake, Strange, and meet your doom." And then Dormammu's army says, "What is this thing, Master?" And then Dormammu says, "It is just a man. Never have you known his like. His people were consumed by my children before you. He's hidden away all these years. He was once a defender of this world." And from the above, Dormammu army laughing at Doctor Strange. And then Dormammu says, "I saved you for last. Now, at your end, tell me, Strange, what happened to your magic? You were not so diminished when we last fought years ago."
And that's really the question that's been hanging in the air this whole time, right? Because even though he's aged, worn down, and clearly not at his peak, he's still Doctor Strange. He should be able to call upon the countless forms of magic at his disposal. But that's where he finally admits, "I spent my magic keeping a friend alive." And Dormammu taunts him and says, "Ha ha, it helped you not." And then Doctor Strange says, "That remains to be seen, Dormammu." And then Dormammu tells him, "After many years of hiding, it is time to finally end this war and disarm you." And the Dormammu breaks Doctor Strange's hands. And so Dormammu says, "Now, Strange, feel the full fury of my magical might." And the Doctor Strange just says, "I knew I could count on you, Dormammu." He reaches into the bag and pulls out the Hulk's head. Holding it there, he looks at it, and then he says, "Now, the rest is up to you, Hulk. I hope you have the appetite for it." And then Dormammu strikes. A devastating blast of pure energy tears forward and says, "Die!" But Doctor Strange didn't die. He's still alive, emerging out of sand with full energy, with the Hulk's head. And Hulk smiles and says, to be honest, very cute smile. And Hulk says, "Ha! Now that was a meal." After watching this all, Dormammu asks, "What have you done, Stephen?" And Doctor Strange says, "Only what I promised you long ago, that I would win. I magically altered the Hulk's diet. His strength isn't fueled by gamma rays anymore. Now he eats magic. After losing my battles, I didn't have enough magic left for this end. That's why I needed you, Dormammu. And this is no ordinary bit of metal. This is what remains of the Silver Surfer's board. I knew I could ride a big enough wave if I had enough energy." And then he screams, "Now, Hulk, go boom!" And Hulk now in rage mode, and he says, "So long, Steve," and explodes like a gamma radiations everywhere. And the Doctor Strange says, "It took decades to find the Hulk and the Silver Surfer's board." And on the verge of destruction, Dormammu says, "Curse you, Strange, curse you to hell." And then Strange says, "And a lifetime to find the courage to make this trip." Because when this bomb goes off, it takes Dormammu down with it, destroyed by his own overwhelming power. And in the aftermath of that blast, Doctor Strange grabs onto the board and is violently hurled out into the depths of space. And as he drifts there, he says,
I'm all out of second chances. And then he says, it all goes back to the train. I was arrogant to demand its destruction. That's where it all went wrong. The train must be preserved. My body was never going to survive. The final stage of this journey can only be accomplished by my astral form, and it can only live for a short time without my body. The Watchers are either a very good sign or a very bad one. I enter unknown space, humbled by my failures, ready to pay the price.
If this is my final death, then it shall be a worthy one. Because when he enters this unknown space, what he's really stepping into is that classic surreal dimension from the earliest days of Doctor Strange comics. Now today, yeah, it just looks cool, visually insane, abstract, almost psychedelic. But back then, this was revolutionary. Nothing like this had ever been seen in comics before. It completely changed how people viewed what comic book art could even be. And that's why this style is still so iconic. To this day, if an original piece from that era, especially untouched raw artwork, showed up at an auction, it could sell for millions to the right collector. That's the level of legacy we're talking about. So seeing Marvel bring that aesthetic back here, it just hits different. And in the middle of that strange, otherworldly space, Doctor Strange says, "If I can succeed in warning the Defenders to change course, then Dormammu's reign on Earth will never happen." And then he says, "As space and time bend and blur past me, I recall the wisdom of one of my teachers. Life is movement, action, change, and never-ending opportunities. I'm home. Now my friends have one last chance to defend this world." Because he's literally sent hurling through space and time, his body barely holding together, until he finally crash lands inside this house. And here's the crazy part. This exact moment connects directly back to where he's first discovered by Bruce Banner in the Immortal Hulk Best Defense one-shot. It all comes full circle. So with that said, guys, that's where we're gonna wrap this up. Let me know if you want me to cover that story too, because honestly, it's really cool and a lot of fun within Marvel. Hope you all enjoyed this one. If you did, make sure to drop a like. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one.